1. She woke in the body of a dead friend. She was 8, tall for her age, fragile of bone, delicate of feature. Her hair was the color of corn silk and slid prettily down her narrow back. Her mother loved to brush it every night, 100 strokes with the soft-bristled, silver-backed brush that sat on the graceful cherry-wood vanity. The child's body remembered this, felt this, each long, sustained beat with the brush, and how it made her imagine herself a cat being petted. How the light slanted over the pin boxes and the bottles of crystal and cobalt, and struck the silver back of the brush as it flashed over her hair. She remembered the scent of the room, smelled it even now. Gardenia, always gardenia for Mama. And in the mirror, by lamplight, she could see the pale oval of her face, so young, so pretty, with those thoughtful blue eyes and smooth skin, so alive. Her name was Hope. The windows and French doors were closed because it was high summer. Heat pressed its damp fingers against the glass, but inside the house the air was cool, and her cotton nightgown stayed so crisp it crackled when she moved. It was the heat she wanted, and the adventure. But she kept those thoughts inside as she kissed Mama goodnight, a dainty peck against a perfumed cheek. Mama had the hall runners taken up and rolled into the attic every June. Now the loblolly pine floors with their coating of paste wax felt slick and smooth under the young girl's bare feet as she wandered out, down the hall with its panels of bald cypress and paintings in thick frames of dull gold, up the sharp winding curves of the stairs to her father's study. There, her father's scent, smoke, leather, Old Spice, and bourbon. She loved this room with its rounded walls and big heavy chairs with leather the color of the port her papa sometimes drank after supper. Here the circling shelves were jammed full with books and treasures. She loved the man who sat behind the enormous desk with his cigar and his shot glass and his ledgers. The love was an ache of the heart in the woman inside the child, a shaft of longing and of envy for that uncomplicated and complete love. His voice boomed, his arms were strong, and his stomach soft as he enveloped her in a hug that was so different from the gentle and restrained goodnight kiss from Mama. "There's my princess, going off to the kingdom of dreams. What will I dream about, Papa? Knights and white chargers and adventures over the sea." She giggled, but rested her head on his shoulder a bit longer than usual, humming a little in her throat like a purring kitten. Did she know? Somehow did she know she would never sit safe on his lap again? Back down the stairs, past Cade's room. Not his bedtime, not yet, because he was 4 years older and a boy and could stay up late on summer nights, watching TV or reading books, as long as he was up and ready for his chores in the morning. One day, Cade would be the master of Beau Rêve and sit at the big desk in the tower study with the ledgers. He would do the hiring and firing and oversee the planting and the harvest and smoke cigars at meetings and complain about the government and the price of cotton, because he was the son. That was fine with Hope. She didn't want to have to sit at a desk and add up figures. She stopped in front of her sister's door, hesitated. It wasn't fine with Faith. Nothing ever seemed to be all right with Faith. Lila, the housekeeper, said Miss Faith would argue with God Almighty just to irritate him. Hope supposed that was true, and even though Faith was her twin, she didn't understand what made her sister so prickly all the time. Just tonight she'd been sent straight to her room for sassing. Now the door was shut tight and there was no light under it. Hope imagined Faith was staring up at the ceiling with that sulky look on her face and her fists clenched tight as if she waited to box with the shadows. Hope touched the doorknob. Most times she could coax Faith out of those black moods. She could huddle in bed with her in the dark and make up stories until Faith laughed and the spit in her eyes dried up again. But tonight was for other things. Tonight was for adventures. It was all planned, but Hope didn't let the excitement come until she was in her own room with the door shut. She left the light off, moving quietly in the dark that was silvered by moonlight. She changed her cotton gown for shorts and a t-shirt. Her heart drummed pleasantly in her chest as she arranged the pillows on the bed in a shape that to her naive and childish eyes resembled a sleeping form. From under the bed she took her adventure kit. The old dome-topped lunchbox held a bottle of Coca-Cola gone warm, a bag of cookies sneaked carefully from the kitchen jar, a small rusted penknife, matches, a compass, a water pistol fully loaded, and a red plastic flashlight. For a moment she sat on the floor. She could smell her crayons and the talc that clung to her own skin from after her bath. She could hear, just barely hear, the music drifting out from her mother's sitting room. When she slid her window open, quietly took out the screen, she was smiling. Young, agile, and bright with anticipation, she swung her leg over the sill, found a toehold in the trellis, mad with vining wisteria. The air was like syrup, and the hot, sweet flavor of it filled her lungs as she climbed down. A splinter stabbed into her finger, causing her to hiss in a breath, but she kept moving, keeping her eyes on the lighted windows of the first floor. She was a shadow, she thought, and no one would see her. She was Hope Lavelle, girl spy, and had a meeting with her contact and partner at precisely 10:35. She had to stifle a giggle and was breathless from the laughter that wanted to bubble out as she hit the ground. To add to her own excitement, she darted and dashed behind the thick trunks of the grand old trees that shaded the house, then peeked around them toward the faint blue light that pulsed against the window in the room where her brother watched TV, up to the clearer yellow glow where each of her parents spent their evening. Discovery now would mean disaster for the mission, she thought, crouching as she raced through the gardens and the sweet scent of roses and night-blooming jasmine. She must avoid capture at all costs, as the fate of the world rested on her shoulders and those of her stalwart partner. The woman inside the child screamed out, "Go back, oh, please go back." But the child didn't hear. She wheeled her pink bike out from behind the camellias where she'd stashed it that afternoon, snuggled her kit into the white basket, then pushed it over the cushion of grass alongside the long gravel drive until the house and the lights were dim with distance. When she rode like the wind, imagining the pretty little bike was a souped-up motorcycle, complete with nerve gas dispenser and oil slick shooter. The white plastic streamers danced from the ends of the handlebars and slapped each other gaily. She flew through the thick air, and the chorus of peepers and cicadas became the panther roar of her speeding machine. At the fork in the road, she bore left, then jumped nimbly off her bike to wheel it off the road down into the narrow gully where it would be hidden by brush. Though the moon was bright enough, she took the flashlight out of her kit. The smiling Princess Leia on her watch told her she was 15 minutes early. Without fear, without thought, she turned onto the narrow path into the marsh, into the end of summer, of childhood, of life. There, the world was alive with sound, water and insects and small night creatures. The light came in thinning ribbons through the canopy of tupelo and cypress with its dripping moss. Here, magnolia blossoms grew fat with a perfume high and sweet. The way to the clearing was second nature to her. This meeting place, this secret place, was well tended, guarded, and loved. As the first to arrive, she took old twigs and stubby branches from the stockpile of wood and set to making a fire. The smoke discouraged mosquitoes, but she scratched idly at bites already dotting her legs and arms. She settled down to wait with a cookie and her Coke. As time passed, her eyes drooped, and the music of the marsh lulled her. The fire ate through the thin scraps of wood, then settled down to a simmer. Drifting, she rested her cheek on her updrawn knees. At first, the rustling was just part of her dream of dodging down twisting Paris streets to evade the wicked Russian spy. But the snap of a twig underfoot had her head jerking up and the sleep clearing from her eyes. The wide grin came first, but she quickly shifted into the stern professional expression of a top-secret agent. "Password." There was silence in the marsh, but for the monotonous buzz of insects and the faint crackle of a fire dying. She scrambled to her feet, the flashlight cocked in her hand like a gun. "Password," she called again, and aimed the short beam of light. But now the rustle came from behind her, so she whirled, heart leaping, beam dancing in nervous jerks. Fear, something so rarely tasted in 8 short years, slicked hot and burning in her throat. "Come on, cut it out. You're not scaring me." A sound from the left, deliberate, taunting. As the next snake of fear curled in her gut, she took a step in retreat, and heard the laughter, soft, panting, close. Running now, running through thick shadows and jumping light, terror so sharp in the throat that it slices screams before they can escape. Footsteps pounding behind her, fast, and too close. Something hits her from behind, bright pain in her back that vibrates down to the soles of her feet. The jolt of bone and breath as she falls hard to the ground. Air rushes out of her lungs in a sob as the weight of him pins her down. She smells sweat and whiskey. She screams now, one long cry of desperation, and calls out for her friend. "Tori, Tori, help me!" And the woman trapped inside the dead child weeps. When Tori came back to herself, she was lying on the flagstones of her patio, wearing only a nightshirt already soaked through from the thin spring rain. Her face was wet, and she tasted the salt of her own tears. Screams echoed in her head, but she didn't know if they were her own or those of the child she couldn't forget. Shivering, she rolled onto her back so the rain could cool her cheeks and wash the tears away. The episodes, spells her mother always called them, often left her weak and queasy. There had been a time she'd been able to fight them off before they swamped her. It had either been that or the shocking sting of her father's belt. "I'll whip the devil out of you, girl." To Hannibal Bodine, the devil was everywhere. In every fear and temptation lurked the hand of Satan, and he'd done his best to drive that wickedness out of his only child. At the moment, with the sickness circling in her belly, Tori wished he'd managed it. It amazed her that for a space of years she'd actually embraced what was in her, had explored it, used it, even celebrated it. A legacy, her grandmother had told her, the sight, the shining, a gift of the blood through the blood. But there was hope. More and more there was hope, and those flashes of her childhood friends' memories hurt her heart and frightened her. Nothing she'd experienced, either blocking or embracing this gift, had taken her like this, taken her away, taken her over. It made her helpless when she'd promised herself she would never be helpless again. Yet here she was, sprawled on her own patio in the rain without any memory of how she got outside. She'd been in the kitchen brewing tea, standing at the counter, the lights and the music on, reading a letter from her grandmother. That was the trigger, Tori realized as she slowly got to her feet. Her grandmother was her link to her childhood, to hope. Into hope, she thought as she closed the patio door, into the pain and fear and horror of that terrible night. And still she didn't know the who or the why. Still shivering, Tori went into the bath, stripped, and turning the shower hot, stepped under the spray. "I can't help you," she murmured, closing her eyes. "I couldn't help you then. I can't help you now." Her best friend, her sister of the heart, had died that night in the swamp while she'd been locked in her room, sobbing over the latest beating. And she had known. She had seen. She had been helpless. Guilt, as fresh as it had been 18 years before, swarmed through her. "I can't help you," she said again, "but I'm coming back." We were 8 years old that summer, that long-ago summer when it seemed those thick, hot days would last forever. It was a summer of innocence and foolishness and friendship, the kind that combines to form a pretty glass globe around your world. One night changed all of that. Nothing's been the same for me since. How could it be? Most of my life I've avoided speaking of it. That didn't stop the memories or the images, but for a time I tried to bury it as hope was buried. To face it now, to record this out loud, if only for myself, is a relief, like pulling a splinter out of the heart. The ache will linger a while. She was my best friend. Our bond had the deep and immediate intensity only children are capable of forging. I suppose we were an odd pair, bright and privileged Hope Lavelle and dark, shy Tori Bodine. My daddy leased a small patch of land, a little corner of the grand plantation hers owned. Sometimes when her mama gave a big society dinner or one of her lavish parties, mine would help out with the cleaning and serving. But those gaps of social standing and class never touched the friendship. Indeed, they never occurred to us. She lived in a grand house, one her reputedly eccentric ancestor had built to resemble a castle rather than the Georgian style so popular during its era. It was stone, with towers and turrets and what you would call battlements, I suppose, but there was nothing of the princess about Hope. She lived for adventures, and when I was with her, so did I. With her, I escaped from the miseries and turmoils of my own house, my own life, and became her partner. We were spies, detectives, knights on quests, pirates or space marauders. We were brave and true, bold and daring. In the spring before that summer, we used her pocket knife to cut a narrow slice in our wrists. Solemnly, we mixed our blood. We were lucky, I suppose, we didn't end up with lockjaw. Instead, we became blood sisters. She had a sister, a twin, but Faith rarely joined in our games. They were too silly for her, or too rough, too dirty. They were always too something for Faith. We didn't miss her temper or complaints. That summer, Hope and I were the twins. If someone had asked me if I loved her, I would have been embarrassed. I wouldn't have understood. But every day since that terrible time, that August, I have missed her as I have missed that part of me that died with her. We were to meet at the swamp in our secret place. I don't suppose it was really much of a secret, but it was ours. We often played there in that damp green air, having our adventures among the birdsong and moss and wild azalea. It was against the rules to go in after sunset, but at 8, rules are an exciting thing to break. I was to bring marshmallows and lemonade. Part of that was pride. My parents were poor, and I was poorer, but I needed to contribute and had counted out the money from the mason jar I hid under my bed. I had $2.86 on that August night, after having bought the supplies at Hanson's. The sum account of my financial worth rested in a glass canning jar and consisted of pennies and nickels and some hard-won quarters. We had chicken and rice for supper. The house was so hot, even with the fans going on high, that eating was a chore. But if there was a grain of rice on your plate, Daddy expected you to eat it and be grateful. Before supper, there was grace. Depending on Daddy's mood, it would last anywhere from 5 minutes to 20, while the food sat going cold and your belly grumbled and the sweat ran down your back in nasty rivers. My grandma used to say that when Hannibal Bodine found God, even God tried to find another place to hide. He was a big man, my father, and grew thick in the chest and arms. I've heard that he was once considered handsome. Years carve a man in different ways, and my father's years had carved him bitter and stern with a meanness under it all. He wore his dark hair slicked back, and his face seemed to rise out of that dome like sharp-edged rocks out of a mountain, rocks that would flay the skin off your bones at one careless misstep. His eyes were dark, too, a burning kind of dark I recognize now in the eyes of some television preachers and street people. My mother feared him. I try to forgive her for that, for fearing him so much she never came to my side when he used his belt to whip his vengeful God into me. That night I was quiet at supper. Chances were he'd take no notice of me if I was quiet and cleaned my plate. Inside me, the anticipation of the night was like a living thing, jittery and joyful. I kept my eyes down, trying to pace my eating so he wouldn't accuse me of dawdling over the food or of bolting it. It was always a fine line to balance with Daddy. I remember the sound of the fans whirling and of forks scraping against plates. I remember the silence of souls hiding in fear that lived in my father's house. When my mother offered him more chicken, he thanked her politely and took a second helping. The room seemed to breathe easier. It was a good sign. My mother, encouraged by this, made some mention of the tomatoes and corn coming in fine and how she'd be canning for the next weeks. They'd be canning over at Beau Rev, too, and did he think it was a good idea for her to help out there as she'd been asked? She didn't mention the wage she'd earn. Even when Daddy's mood was mild, you were wise not to bring up the coin that the Lavells would dole out for a service. He was the breadwinner in his house, and we were not permitted to forget this all-important point. The room held its breath again. There were times just the mention of the Lavells put the thunder in Daddy's dark eyes, but that night he allowed us that would be a sensible thing, as long as she didn't neglect any of her chores under the roof he was putting over her head. This relatively pleasant response made her smile. I remember how her face softened up and how it made her almost pretty again. Now and again, if I think very hard, I can remember Mama being pretty. Han, she called him when she was smiling. Tori and I'll keep things going around here, don't you worry. I'll go on over and talk to Miss Lila tomorrow and see about getting it all done. With the berries coming in, I'll be making jelly, too. I know I've got some paraffin around here, but I just can't think where it's got to. And just that casual remark about jelly and wax and absent-mindedness changed everything. I suppose my mind had drifted off during their conversation, that I was thinking of the adventure to come. I spoke without thought, without knowledge of the consequences, so I said the words that damned me. The box of paraffin's in the top shelf of the cabinet over the stove, up there behind the molasses and the cornstarch. I simply said what I saw in my head, the square box of block wax behind the dark bottle of blackstrap, and reached for my cold sweet tea to wash down the starchy grains of rice. Before I took the first sip, I heard the silence come back, the mute wave that swamped even the monotonous hum of fans. My heart started to pound inside that vacuum, one hard hammer strike after the next, with a ringing that was only inside my own head and was the sudden and vicious pulse of blood, the pulse of fear. He spoke softly then, as he did, always did, just before the rage. "How do you know where the wax is, Victoria? How do you know it's up there where you can't see it, where you can't reach it?" I lied. It was foolish, because I was already doomed, but the lie tumbled out, a desperate defense. I told him I guess I saw Mama put it there. I just remember seeing her put it there is all. He tore that lie to shreds. He had a way of seeing through lies and ripping them to uneven pieces and sticky parts. When did I see that? Why didn't I do better in school if my memory was so keen I could remember where the paraffin was a year after the last cannon season? And how was it I knew it was behind the molasses and cornstarch and not in front of them or beside them? Oh, he was a clever man, my father, and never missed the smallest of details. Mama said nothing while he spoke in that soft voice, punching the words at me like fists wrapped in silk. She folded her hands, and her hands shook. Did she tremble for me? I suppose I like to think so. But she said nothing as his voice grew louder, nothing as he shoved back from the table. Nothing as the glass slipped from my hand and crashed to the floor. A shard of it nicked my ankle, and through the rising terror I felt that little pain. He checked first, of course. He would tell himself that was the fair thing, the right thing to do. When he opened the cabinet, pushed aside the bottles, slowly took that square blue box of canning wax out from behind the dark molasses, I cried. I still had tears in me then. I still had hope. Even as he yanked me to my feet, I had the hope that the punishment would only be prayers, hours of prayer until my knees went numb. Sometimes, at least sometimes that summer, that was enough for him. Hadn't he warned me not to let the devil in? But still, I brought wickedness into his house, shamed him before God. I said I was sorry, that I didn't mean to. Please, Daddy, please, I won't do it again. I'll be good. I begged him. He shouted scripture and with his big, hard hands dragged me toward my room. But still I begged him. It was the last time I did so. There was no fighting back. It was worse if you fought him. The fourth commandment was a sacred thing, and you would honor your father in his house even when he beat you bloody. His face was deep red with his righteousness, big and blinding as the sun. He only slapped me once. That was all it took to stop my pleading and my excuses, and to kill my hope. I lay across the bed on my stomach, passive now as any sacrificial lamb. The sound his belt made when he slid it out of the loops on his work pants was a snake hissing, then a crack, sharp, slick, as he snapped it. He always snapped it 3 times, a holy trinity of cruelty. The first whip is always the worst. No matter how many times there's been a first, the shock and pain is stunning and rips a scream from your belly. Your body jerks in protest. No, in disbelief. Then the second slap bites into you, and the third. Soon your cries are more animal than human. Your humanity has been compromised, buried under an avalanche of pain and humiliation. He would preach as he beat me, and his voice would become a great roar. And under that roar was a hideous excitement, a vile sort of pleasure I didn't understand and recognize. No child should know that slippery undercoating, and from that, for a time, I was spared. The first time he beat me, I was 5. My mother tried to stop him, and he blackened her eye for it. She never tried again. I don't know what she did that night while he wailed away, beating at the devil that gave me visions. I couldn't see, not with eyes nor with mind, anything but a blood-red haze. The haze was hate, but I didn't recognize that either. He left me weeping and locked the door from the outside. After a while, the pain sent me to sleep. When I awoke, it was dark, and it seemed a fire burned in me. I can't say the pain was unbearable, because you bear it. What choice is there? I prayed, too, prayed that whatever was inside of me had finally been driven out. I didn't want to be wicked. Yet even as I prayed, the pressure built in my belly and the tingling came like sharp little fingers dancing over the back of my neck. It was the first time it came into me this way, and I thought I was sick, feverish. Then I saw Hope, as vividly as if I were sitting beside her in our clearing in the swamp. I smelled the night, the water, heard the whine of mosquitoes, the buzz of insects, and like Hope I heard the rustling in the brush. Like Hope, I felt the fear, fresh, hot gushes of it. When she ran, I ran, my breath sobbing out so that my chest hurt from it. I saw her fall under the weight of whatever leaped out at her, a shadow, a shape I couldn't see clearly, though I could see her. She called for me, screamed for me. Then I saw nothing but black. When I woke, the sun was up, and I was on the floor, and Hope was gone. 2. She'd chosen to lose herself in Charleston, and for nearly 4 years had managed it. The city had been like a lovely and generous woman to her, more than willing to press her against its soft bosom and soothe the nerves that had shattered on the unforgiving streets of New York City. In Charleston, the voices were slower, and in their warm, fluid stream she could blend. She could hide, as she'd once believed she could hide in the thick, rushing crowds of the North. Money wasn't a problem. She knew how to live frugally and was willing to work. She guarded her savings like a hawk, and when that nest egg began to grow, allowed herself to dream of owning her own business, working for herself and living the quiet and settled life that always eluded her. She kept to herself. Real friendships meant real connections. She hadn't been willing or strong enough to open herself to that again. People asked questions. They wanted to know things about you or pretended they did. Tori had no answers to give and nothing to tell. She found the little house old, run down, perfect, and had bargained fiercely to buy it. People often underestimated Victoria Bodine. They saw a young woman small and slight of build. They saw the soft skin and delicate features, a serious mouth, and clear gray eyes they often mistook for guileless. A small nose, just a little crooked, added a touch of sweetness to a face framed by quiet brown hair. They saw fragility, heard it in the gentle southern flow of her voice, and never saw the steel inside, steel forged by countless strikes with a Sam Browne belt. What she wanted, she worked for, fought for, with all the focus and determination of a frontline soldier taking a beach. She'd wanted the old house with its overgrown yard and peeling paint, and she'd wheeled and dealed, badgered and pushed until it was hers. Apartments brought back memories of New York and the disaster that had ended her life there. There would be no more apartments for Tori. She'd nurtured that investment as well, using her own time and labor and skill to rehabilitate the house one room at a time. It had taken her 3 full years, and now the sale of it, added to her savings, was going to make her dream come true. All she had to do was go back to progress. At her kitchen table, Tori read over the rental agreement for the storefront on Market Street a 3rd time. She wondered if Mr. Harlow at the realtor's office remembered her. She'd been barely 10 when they'd moved away from Progress to Raleigh so her parents could find steady work. Better work, her father had claimed, than scratching out a living on a played-out plot of land leased from the almighty Lavells. Of course, they'd been just as poor in Raleigh as they'd been in Progress. They'd just been more crowded. Didn't matter, Tori reminded herself. She wasn't going back poor. She wasn't the scared and skinny girl she'd been, but a businesswoman starting a new enterprise in her hometown. Then why, her therapist would ask, are your hands trembling? Anticipation, Tori decided, excitement, and nerves. All right, there were nerves. Nerves were human. She was entitled to them. She was normal. She was whatever she wanted to be. Damn it. Teeth gritted, she snatched up the pen and signed the agreement. It was only for a year, 1 year. If it didn't work out, she could move on. She'd moved on before. It seemed she was always moving on. But before she moved on this time, there was a great deal to be done. The lease agreement was only one thin layer of a mountain of paperwork. Most, the licenses and permits for the shop she intended to open, were signed and sealed. She considered the state of South Carolina little better than a mugger, but she'd paid the fees. Next up was the settlement on the house and dealing with the lawyers who she'd decided gave muggers a bad name. But by the end of day, she'd have the check in her hand and be on her way. The packing was nearly finished. Not that much to it, she thought now, as she'd sold nearly everything she'd acquired since her move to Charleston. Traveling light simplified things, and she'd learned early never to become attached to anything that could be taken from her. Rising, she washed out her cup, dried it, then wrapped it in newspaper to store in the small box of kitchen utensils she thought most practical to take with her. From the window over the sink, she looked out at her tiny backyard. The little patio was scrubbed and swept. She would leave the clay pots of verbena and white petunias for the new owners. She hoped they would tend the garden, but if they plowed it under, well, it was theirs to do as they liked. She'd left her mark here. They might paint and paper, carpet and tile, but what she had done would have come first. It would always be under the rest. You couldn't erase the past, or kill it, or wish it out of existence. Nor could you will away the present, or change what was coming. We were all trapped in that cycle of time, just circling around the core of yesterdays. Sometimes those yesterdays were strong enough, willful enough, to suck you back no matter how hard you struggled. And how much more depressing could she be, Tori thought with a sigh. She sealed the box, hefted it to take out to her car, and walked out of the kitchen without looking back. 3 hours later, the check from the sale of her house was deposited. She shook hands with the new owners, listened politely to their giddy enthusiasm over buying their first home, and eased her way outside. The house and the people who would now live in it were no longer part of her world. "Tori, hold on a minute." Tori turned, one hand on the car door, and her mind already on the road. But she waited until her lawyer crossed the bank parking lot. Meandered was more the word, Tori corrected. Abigail Lawrence didn't hurry anything, especially herself, which probably explained why she always looked as though she'd just stepped graciously from the pages of Vogue. For today's settlement, she'd chosen a pale blue suit, pearls that had likely been handed down from her great-grandmother, and thinly spiked heels that made Tori's toes cramp just looking at them. "Phew!" Abigail waved a hand in front of her face as if she'd just run 2 miles rather than strolled 10 yards. "All this heat, and it's barely April." She glanced past Tori to the station wagon, scanned the boxes. "So that's it?" "Seems to be. Thank you, Abigail, for handling everything." "You handled most of it. Don't know when I've had a client who understood what I was talking about half the time, much less one who could give me lessons." She took a peek into the back of the station wagon, vaguely surprised that one woman's life took up so little room. "I didn't think you were serious about heading straight out this afternoon. I should have known." She shifted her gaze back to Tori's face. "You're a serious woman, Victoria." "No reason to stay." Abigail opened her mouth, then shook her head. "I was going to say I envy you, packing it up, taking what fits in the back of your car and going off to a new place, a new life, a new start. But the fact is, I don't, not one little bit. God Almighty, the energy it takes and the guts. Then again, you're young enough to have plenty of both." "Maybe a new start, but it's back to my beginnings. I still have family in progress, such as it is." "You ask me, it takes more guts to go back to the beginning than just about any place else. I hope you're happy, Tori." "I'll be fine." "Fine's one thing." To Tori's surprise, Abigail took her hand, then leaned over and brushed her cheek in a light kiss. "Happy's another. Be happy." "I intend to." Tori drew back. There was something in the hand-to-hand connection, something in the concern in Abigail's eyes. "You knew," Tori murmured. "Of course I did." Abigail gave Tori's fingers a light squeeze before releasing them. "News from New York winds its way down here, and some of us even pay attention to it now and again. You changed your hair, your name, but I recognized you. I'm good with faces." "Why didn't you say anything? Ask me." "You hired me to see to your business, not pry into it. The way I figured it is, if you'd wanted people to know you were the Victoria Mooney who made news out of New York City a few years back, you'd have said so." "Thank you for that." The formality and the caution had Abigail grinning. "For heaven's sake, honey, do you think I'm going to ask you if my son's ever going to get married or where the hell I lost my mama's diamond engagement ring? All I'm saying is I know you've been through some rough times, and I hope you find better. Now, if you have any problems up there in progress, you just give a holler." Simple kindness never failed to fluster her. Tori fumbled with the door handle. "Thank you. Really. I'd better get started. I have several stops to make." But she held out her hand once more. "I appreciate everything. Drive safe." Tori slid inside, hesitated, then opened the window as she started the engine. In the middle file cabinet drawer of your home office between the D's and the E's. What's that? Your mother's ring. It's a little too big for you and it slipped off, fell in the files. You should have it sized. Tori reversed quickly, swung the car around while Abigail blinked after her. She headed west out of Charleston, then dipped south to begin her planned circle of the state before landing in Progress. The list of artists and craftsmen she intended to visit was neatly typed and in her new briefcase. Directions for each were included, and it meant taking a number of back roads, time-consuming but necessary. She'd already made arrangements with several Southern artists to display and sell their work in the shop she would open on Market Street, but she needed more. Starting small didn't mean not starting well. Startup costs, buying stock, finding an acceptable place to live were going to take nearly every penny she'd saved. She intended to make it worthwhile, and she intended to make more. In a week, if everything went as planned, she would begin setting up shop. By the end of May, she would open the doors. Then they would see. As for the rest, she would deal with what came when it came. When the time was right, she would drive down that long, shady lane to Beau Rev and face the Lavells. She would face hope. At the end of a week, Tori was exhausted, several $100s poorer thanks to a cracked radiator, and ready to call an end to her travels. The replacement radiator meant she had to postpone her arrival in Florence until the following morning and make do for a night with the dubious comfort of a motel off Route 9 outside Chester. The room stank of stale smoke, and its amenities included a sliver of soap and pay movies designed to stimulate the sexual appetites of the rent-by-the-hour clientele that kept the establishment out of bankruptcy. There were stains on the carpet, the origin of which she decided it best not to contemplate. She'd paid cash for one night because she didn't like the idea of handing over her credit card to a sly-eyed clerk who smelled like the gin he cleverly disguised in a coffee mug. The room was as unappealing as the idea of climbing back behind the wheel for another hour, but it was there. Tori carried the single flimsy chair to the door and hooked its spindly top under the knob. She decided it was every bit as security-proof as the thin and rusted chain. Still, using both gave her the illusion of safety. It was a mistake, she knew, to allow herself to become so fatigued. Resistance went down. But everything had conspired against her. The Potter she'd seen in Greenville had been temperamental and difficult to pin down. If he hadn't also been brilliant, Tori would have walked out of his studio after 20 minutes instead of spending 2 hours praising, placating, and persuading. The car had taken another 4 hours between getting towed, negotiating for a reconditioned radiator at the junkyard, browbeating the mechanic to do the repair on the spot. Add to that, she admitted it was her own stupidity that had landed her in the by-the-way inn. If she'd simply booked a room back in Greenville or stopped at one of the perfectly respectable motor lodges on the interstate, she wouldn't be stumbling with exhaustion around a smelly room. Only one night, she reminded herself, as she eyed the dingy green cover on the bed. For pocket change, it offered the questionable delights of magic fingers. She decided to pass. Just a few hours' sleep, then she'd be on her way to Florence, where her grandmother would have the guest room, clean sheets, a hot bath, ready. She just had to get through the night. Without even taking off her shoes, she lay down on the spread and closed her eyes. Bodies in motion, slicked with sweat. Baby, yeah, baby, give it to me, harder. A woman weeping, pain rolling through her, hot as lava. Oh, God, God, what am I going to do? Where can I go? Any place but back. Please don't let him find me. Scattered thoughts and fumbling hands, all panicked excitement and raging guilt. What if I get pregnant? My mother will kill me. Is it going to hurt? Does he really love me? Images, thoughts, voices washed over her in waves of shapes and sounds. Leave me alone, she demanded. Just leave me alone. With her eyes still shut, Tori imagined a wall, thick and high and white. She built it brick by brick until it stood between her and all the memories left hanging in the room like smoke. Behind the wall was all cool, clear blue, water to float in, to sink in, and finally to sleep in. And high above that pale blue pool, the sun was white and warm. She could hear birdsong and the lap of water as she trailed her hands through it. Her body was weightless here, her mind quiet. At the edges of the pool she could see the grand live oaks and their lacing of moss, and a willow bowing like a courtier to dip its fronds in the glassy surface. Smiling to herself, she closed her eyes and drifted, The sound of laughter was high and bright, a girl's careless joy. Lazily, Tori opened her eyes. There by the willow, Hope stood, waving. "Hey, Tori! Hey, I was looking for you!" Joy struck first, a bright arrow. Turning in the water, Tori waved back. "Come on in, the water's great. We get caught skinny dipping, we're both going to get it." But giggling, Hope shucked off her shoes, her shorts, then her shirt. "I thought you went away." "Don't be dopey. Where would I go?" "I've been looking for a long time." Slowly, Hope eased into the water. Willow slim and marble white, her hair spread out to float on the surface, gold against blue. Forever and ever. The water darkened, began to stir. The graceful fronds of the willow snapped up like whips, and the water was cold, suddenly so cold Tori began to shiver. "Storm's coming up. We better go in." "It's over my head. I can't reach the bottom. You have to help me." As the water churned, Hope flailed out, her thin young arms beating, spewing up curtains of water that had gone the murky brown of a marsh. Tori struck out, strong strokes, frantic speed, but every arm span took her farther away from where the young girl struggled. The water burned her lungs, dragged at her feet. She felt herself going under, felt herself drowning with Hope's voice inside her head. "You have to come. You have to hurry." She awoke in the dark, her mouth full of the taste of the swamp. Without the heart or energy to build her wall again, Tori rolled out of bed. In the bathroom, she splashed rusty water on her face, then raced it dripping to the mirror. Eyes shadowed and still glazed from the dream stared back at her. Too late to turn back, she thought. It always was. She grabbed her purse and the unused travel kit she'd brought in with her. The dark was soothing now, and the candy bar and soft drink she'd bought from the rumbling vending machine outside her room kept her system wired. She turned on the radio to distract her mind. She wanted to think of nothing but the road. When she hit the heart of the state, the sun was up and the traffic thick. She stopped to refuel the gas-guzzling station wagon before heading east. When she passed the exit that led to where her parents had once again relocated, her stomach clenched and stayed tight for another 30 miles. She thought of her grandmother, of the stock loaded in the back of the car or being shipped to Progress. She thought of her budget for the next 6 months and the work involved in having her store up and running by Memorial Day. She thought of anything but the real reason driving her back to Progress. Just outside of Florence, she stopped again and used the restroom of a Shell station to brush her hair, apply some makeup. The artifice wouldn't fool her grandmother, but at least she'd have made an effort. She stopped again on impulse at a florist. Her grandmother's gardens were always a showplace, but the dozen pink tulips were another kind of effort. She had lived, Tori reminded herself, just under 2 hours from her grandmother and hadn't made the trip, the effort of it, since Christmas. When she turned down the pretty street with its blooming dogwoods and redbuds, she wondered why. It was a good place, the kind of neighborhood where children played in the yards and dogs napped in the shade. A gossip over the backyard fence kind of place where people noticed strange cars and kept their eye on their neighbor's house as much out of consideration as curiosity. Iris Mooney's house sat in the middle of the block, bandbox neat with old and enormous azaleas guarding the foundation. The blooms were past their peak, but the faded pinks and purples added a delicate color to the strong blue paint her grandmother had chosen. As expected, her front garden was lush and lovely, the gentle slope of the yard well trimmed, and the stoop scrubbed and swept. A pickup truck with the sign "Anytime Plumbing" was parked in the drive behind her grandmother's aging compact. Tori pulled to the curb. The tension she'd ignored along the drive began to ease as she walked toward the house. She didn't knock. She'd never had to knock on this door and had always known it would open and welcome to her. There'd been times when that alone had kept her from crumbling. It surprised her to find the house quiet. It was nearly 10, she noted as she stepped inside. She'd expected to find her grandmother in her garden or fussing around inside the house. The living room was cluttered, as always, with furniture, knickknacks, books, and, Tori noted, a vase holding a dozen red roses that made her tulips look like poor relations. She set aside her suitcase, her purse, then turning toward the hallway, called out, "Gran, are you home?" Carrying the flowers, she started back toward the bedrooms, then lifted her eyebrows when she heard the movement behind her grandmother's closed door. "Tori, honeypot, I'll be right out. Go on back and get yourself some iced tea." With a shrug, Tori kept walking toward the kitchen, glancing back once when she heard what sounded like a muffled giggle. She laid the flowers on the counter, then opened the refrigerator. The pitcher of tea was waiting, made as she enjoyed it most, with slices of lemon and sprigs of mint. Gran never forgot anything, Tori thought, and felt tears of sentiment and fatigue sting her eyes. She blinked them back when she heard Gran's quick steps. "Goodness, you're early. I didn't expect you till afternoon, if that." Small, slim, and agile, Iris Mooney swept into the room and caught Tori in a hard hug. "I got an early start and just kept going. Did I wake you? Aren't you feeling well?" "What? You're still in your robe." "Oh," after one last squeeze, Iris drew back. "I'm just as fine as rain. Let me look at you. Oh, honey, you're wore out." "Just a little tired. But you look wonderful." It was inevitably true. 67 years of living had lined her face, but it hadn't dulled the magnolia skin or dimmed the deep gray of her eyes. Her hair had been red in her youth, and she saw that it remained that way. If God had meant a woman to be gray, Iris liked to say, he wouldn't have invented Miss Clairol. She took care of herself and pampered her looks, which she thought now was more than she could say about her granddaughter. "You sit right down here. I'm going to fix you some breakfast." "Don't trouble, Gran. You know better than to argue with me, don't you? Now sit." She pointed to a chair at the little ice cream parlor table. "Oh, look at these. Aren't they pretty?" She swept up the tulips, her delight in them sparkling in her eyes. "You're the sweetest thing, my Tori." "I've missed you, Gran. I'm sorry I haven't visited." "You've got your own life, which is what I always wanted for you. Now you just relax, and when you've got your feet back under you, you can tell me all about your trip." "It was worth every mile. I found some wonderful pieces." "Got my eye for pretty things." She winked, turning just in time to see her granddaughter gape at the man who had stepped into the kitchen doorway. He was tall as an oak with a chest wide as a Buick. His grizzled hank of hair was the color and texture of steel wool. His eyes were the burnished brown of acorns and drooped like a basset hound's. His leathered face was tanned to match. He cleared his throat with an exaggerated flourish, then nodded at Tori. "Mornin'," he began in an up-country drawl. Miss Mooney, I got that drain cleared for you." "Cecil, stop being a moron. You don't even have your toolbox with you." Iris set aside a carton of eggs. "No need to blush," she told him. "My granddaughter's not going to faint at the notion her grandma's got herself a beau. Tori, this is Cecil Axton, the reason I'm not dressed at 10 this morning." "Iris." The blush rose up to his cheeks like fire under cordwood. "I'm pleased to meet you, Tori. Your gran's been looking forward to seeing you." "How do you do?" Tori said, for lack of something more clever. She offered a hand, and because she was still dazed and Cecil's feelings were so close to the surface, she had a quick and blurred image of just what had made her grandmother giggle behind the bedroom door. She shut it off fast as her eyes met Cecil's with mutual mortification. You're a plumber, Mr. Axton?" "He came to fix my water heater," Iris put in, "and's been keeping me warm ever since." "Iris." Cecil ducked his head, hunched the twin mountains of his shoulders, but couldn't quite hide the grin. "I got to get on. Hope you enjoy your visit, Tori." "Don't you think about running off without kissing me goodbye." To solve the matter, Iris crossed to him, took his weathered face between her hands to pull it down to her level, and kissed him firm on the mouth. "There now, lightning did not strike, thunder did not roll, and the child here did not collapse in shock." She kissed him again, then patted his cheek. "You go on, handsome, and have a good day." "I guess I'll, see you later." "You better. We decided on this, Cecil. Now you scat. I'll talk to Tori." "I'm going." With a hesitant smile, he turned to Tori. "You can argue with this woman, but it just gives you a headache." He took a faded blue gimme cap from a kitchen peg, set it on his wiry hair, and hurried out. "Isn't he the cutest thing? I got some nice lean bacon here. How do you want your eggs?" "In chocolate chip cookies." "Gran." Tori drew a careful breath and rose. "It's absolutely none of my business, but—" "Of course it's not your business unless I invite you into it, which I have." Iris laid bacon in the old black spider skillet to sizzle. "I'm going to be very disappointed in you, Tori, if you're shocked and appalled by the idea of your grandmother having a sex life." Tori winced, but managed to compose her face when Iris turned toward her. "Not shocked, not appalled, but certainly a little disconcerted. The idea of coming here this morning and nearly walking in on, Well, you were early, honey pot. I'm going to fry these eggs, and we're both going to indulge in a nice, greasy mid-morning breakfast." "I guess you worked up an appetite." Iris blinked, then threw back her head and laughed. "Now that's my girl. You worry me, Sugar Plum, when you don't smile. What have I got to smile about? You're the one having sex. Amused, Iris cocked her head. And whose fault is that? Yours. You saw Cecil first. Tori got down 2 glasses, poured the tea. How many women, she wondered, could claim a grandmother who had hot affairs with the plumber? She wasn't sure whether she should be proud or amused, and decided the combination of both suited the situation. He seems like a very nice man. He is. Better, he's a very good man. Iris poked at the bacon and decided to get it done all at once. Tori, he's living here. Living? You're living with him? He wants to get married, but I'm not sure that's what I want, so I'm taking him for what you might call a test drive. I think I'll just sit down after all. Jesus, Gran, have you told Mama? No, and I don't intend to, as I can live without the lecture on living in sin and perdition and God's almighty plan. Your Mama's the biggest pain in the butt since self-service gas stations. How any daughter of mine turned out to be such a mouse of a woman is beyond me. Survival, Tori murmured, but Iris only snarled. She'd have survived just fine if she'd walked out on that son of a bitch she married 25 years ago or any day since. That's her choice, Tori. If she'd had any gumption, she'd have made a different one. You did. Did I? I don't know what choices I made or which were made for me. I don't know which were right and which were wrong. And here I am, Gran, circling right back to where I started. I tell myself I'm in charge now, that it's all my decision. But under it all, I know I just can't stop it. Do you want to? I don't know the answer. Then you'll just keep going till you find it. You've got such a strong light in you, Tori. You'll find your way. So you always said, but the one thing that's always scared me the most is being lost. I should have helped you more. I should have been there for you. Gran, Tori rose, crossed the room to wrap her arms around Iris's waist, to press cheek to cheek while the bacon snapped and sizzled. You've always been the one steady hand in my life. I wouldn't be here without you. Yes, you would. Iris patted Tori's hand, then briskly lifted out bacon to drain. You're stronger than the lot of us put together. And that, if you ask me, is what scared Hannibal Bodine. He wanted to break you out of his own fear. In the end, well, he forged you, didn't he? Ignorant S.O.B. She cracked an egg on the side of the skillet, let it slide into the bubbling grease. Make us some toast, honeypot. She's nothing like you, Mama, Tori said as she dropped bread into the toaster. She's nothing like you at all. I don't know what Sarah Beth's like. I lost her years ago, same time I lost your granddaddy, I suppose. She was only 12 when he died. Hell, I was hardly more than 30 myself and found myself a widow with 2 children to raise on my own. That was the worst year of my life. Nothing's ever come close to matching it. Sweet Jesus, I love that man. She let out a sigh, flipped the eggs onto plates. He was my world, my Jimmy. One minute the world was steady and the next it was just gone. And there's Sarah Beth, 12 years old, and J.R. barely 16. She went wild on me. Maybe I could have reined her in. God knows I should have. Can't blame yourself. I don't, but you see things when you look back. See how if one thing was done different, the whole picture of a life changes. If I'd moved away from Progress back then, if I'd used Jimmy's insurance instead of taking a job at the bank, if I hadn't been so hell-bent to save so my children could have a college education. You wanted the best for 'em. I did. Iris set the plates on the table, turned to get butter and jelly from the refrigerator. J.R. got his college education, and he used it. Sarah Beth got Hannibal Bodine. That's the way it was meant to be. That's why my granddaughter and I are going to sit here and eat a couple of heart attacks on a plate. If I could go back and do that one thing different, I wouldn't, because I wouldn't have you. I'm going back, Gran, knowing I can't do anything different. Tori put the toast on a little plate and carried it to the table. It scares me that I need to go back so much. I don't know those people anymore. I'm afraid I won't know myself once I'm there. You won't settle yourself till you do this thing, Tori. Until you take hold of it, you can't let go of it. You've been heading back to Progress since you left it. I know. And having someone else understand that helped. Smiling a little, Tori lifted a slice of bacon. So, tell me about your plumber. Oh, that sweetie pie. Delighted with the topic, Iris dug into her breakfast. Looks like a big old bear, don't he? You wouldn't guess looking at him how smart he is. Started that company on his own over 40 years back. Lost his wife. I knew her slightly about 5 years ago. He's mostly retired now. 2 of his sons do most of the running of the business. Got 6 grandsons. 6? Yes, indeed. Fact is, one of them's a doctor. Good-looking young man. I was thinking, stop right there. Eyes narrowed, Tori slathered jelly on toast. I'm not interested. How do you know? You hadn't even met the boy. I'm not interested in boys or men. Tori, you haven't been involved with a man since Jack, Tori finished. That's right, and I don't intend to be involved again. Once was enough. Since it still left a bitter taste in her mouth, she picked up her tea. Not all of us are made to be half of a couple, Gran. I'm happy on my own. At Iris's lifted eyebrows, Tori shrugged. Okay, let's say I intend to be happy on my own. I'm going to work my ass off to make sure of it. 3. It had been too long, Tori thought, since she'd sat on a porch swing, watching the stars come out and hearing the crickets chirp. A long time since she'd been relaxed enough to simply sit and smell the breeze. Even as she thought it, she realized it was likely to be a long time before she did so again. Tomorrow she'd travel the last miles to Progress. There she would pick up the pieces of her life and finally lay a dead friend to rest. But tonight was for soft breezes and quiet thoughts. She glanced up at the squeak of the screen door and offered Cecil a smile. Her grandmother was right, she decided. He did look like a big old bear, and at the moment a very nervous one. Iris kicked me out of the kitchen. He had a dark brown bottle of beer in one hand and shifted uneasily from foot to foot on size 14 boots. She said how I should come on out here and sit a spell and keep you company. She wants us to be friends. Why don't you sit a spell? I'd like the company. Feels a little funny. He eased his bulk down on the swing, darted a look at Tori out of the corner of his eye. I know what you young people think, an old coot like me courting a woman like Iris. He still smelled of the lava soap he'd used to wash up before dinner. Lava soap, Tori mused, and Coors. It was a pleasantly male combination. Your family doesn't approve? Oh, they're all right with it now. Iris has charmed the socks off my boys. She's got that way about her. One son, Jerry, he got a mite huffy about it, but she brought him around. The thing is... He trailed off, cleared his throat twice. Tori folded her hands and bit back a grin as he launched into what was surely a prepared speech. You're mighty important to her, Tori. I guess you're about the most important thing there is to Iris. She's proud of you, and she worries about you, and she brags on you. I know there's a rift between her and your mama. I guess you could say that makes you even more special to her. The feeling's mutual. I know it. I could see how it is over dinner. The thing is, he said again, then lifted his beer and gulped deeply. Aw, hell, I love her. He blurted it out and color sprang into his cheeks. I guess that sounds foolish to you coming from a man who won't see 65 again, but... Why would it? She wasn't comfortable with casual touching, but since he seemed to need it, she patted his knee. And what does age have to do with it? Gran cares for you. That's good enough for me. Relief slid through him. Tori could hear it in his sigh. I never thought I'd have these feelings again. I was married 46 years to a wonderful woman. We grew up together, raised a family together, started a business together. When I lost her, I figured that was the end of that part of my life. And then I met Iris, and Christ Jesus, she makes me feel 20 years old again. You put stars in her eyes. He blushed deeper at that, but his lips twitched into a shy and delighted smile. Yeah, I'm good with my hands. At Tori's uncontrollable snort of laughter, his eyes went huge. I mean to say I'm handy around the house, fixing stuff. I know what you meant. And Stella, that was my wife. I guess you could say she trained me pretty good. I know better than to track in mud on a clean floor, to toss dirty towels on the floor. I can cook a little if you're not too particular, and I've got a decent living. Gran was right, Tori decided. The man was a sweetie pie. Cecil, are you asking for my blessing? He huffed out a breath. I mean to marry her. She won't hear of it just now. Mule stubborn, that woman. But I got a hard head of my own. Just want you to know I'm not taking advantage, that my intentions are honorable, Tori finished, wonderfully moved. I'm pulling for you. Yeah? He sat back again, making the swing groan. That's a relief to me, Tori. That's a relief, all right. God almighty, I'm glad that's over. With a shake of his head, he drank more beer. My tongue gets all tangled up. You did fine. Cecil, you keep her happy. I aim to. At ease again, he draped his arm over the back of the swing and looked out over Iris's back garden. Nice night. Yeah, a very nice night. She slept deep and dreamless in her grandmother's house. I wish you'd stay just another day or two. I have to get started. Iris nodded, struggling not to fuss as Tori carried her suitcase toward the car. "You'll call once you settle in a bit." "Course I will. And you go see J.R. right off so he and Boots can help you along." "I'll go see him and Aunt Boots and Wade." She kissed both her grandmother's cheeks. "Now stop worrying." "I'm just missing you already. Give me your hands." When Tori hesitated, Iris simply took them. "Indulge me, honey pot." She held firm, her eyes blurring a bit as she focused. She didn't have the brilliance of light her granddaughter had been gifted with. She saw in colors and shapes. The smudgy gray of worry, the shimmering pink of excitement, the dull blue of grief. And through it all was the dark, deep red of love. "You'll be all right." Iris gave her hands a last squeeze. "I'll be right here if you need me." "I've always known that." Tori climbed in the car, took a deep breath. "Don't tell them where I am, Gran." Iris shook her head, knowing Tori meant her parents. "I won't." "I love you." She kept her eyes straight ahead as she drove away. The fields began to roll, gentle ripples on the earth covered with the tender green of growing things. She recognized the row crops, soybeans, tobacco, cotton. The delicate shoots hazed the brown soil. She'd missed planting time. The land had never called to her as it did to some. She enjoyed puttering in a flower garden now and then, but had no driving need to feel earth under her hands, to tend and harvest, to put by what she'd grown. Still, she appreciated the cycle, the continuity. She enjoyed the look of it. The neat and practical fields men plowed and nurtured, rode side by side with the tangled lushness of the live oaks and moss, the ubiquitous sumac, the ribbons of dark water that could never, would never be truly tamed. The smell of it was rich and again dark, fertilizer and swamp water. More, she thought, the perfume of the South than any magnolia. This was its true heart, after all. Beyond the formal gardens and lavish lawns, the South beat on crops and sweat and the secret shadows of its rivers. She'd taken the back roads for solitude, and with every mile felt herself drawn closer to that heart. On the west edge of Progress, some of the farms and fields had given way to homes, tidy developments with yards kept green and lush with underground sprinklers. There were late-model sedans and minivans in the drives, and sidewalks running wide and even. Here were the young married, she mused, most with double incomes who wanted a nice home in the suburbs for raising a family. These were her target customers, and the primary reason she'd been able to justify the move. Successful homeowners with disposable income enjoyed decorating their space. With the right advertising and clever displays, she would draw them into her shop, and they would buy. Were there any living well in those quiet homes she'd known as a child? Any who might remember the thin young girl who'd come to school with bruises? Would they remember she'd sometimes known things she wasn't supposed to know? Memories were short, Tori reminded herself, and even if some remembered, she would find a way to use it to promote her store. The houses elbowed closer together as she approached the town line, as if they were anxious for company. Into her mind flashed an image of the far side, where the narrow whip of the river was the border of Progress. In her youth, the houses that slipped and slithered down into the holler had been small and dark, with leaky roofs and rusted trucks that most often stood on chipped cinder blocks. A place where dogs snarled and leaped viciously at the ends of their chains, where the women hung out dingy laundry while children sat on patchy grass that was mostly dirt. Some of the men farmed to eke out a living, and some of them simply lived on beer and mead. As a child, she'd been one shaky step above that fate, and even as a child she'd feared losing the balance and tumbling into the holler where daily bread was served with exhaustion. She saw the church steeple first. The town boasted 4, or had. Still, nearly everyone she'd known had belonged to the Baptist church. She'd sat countless hours on one of the hard pews, listening desperately to the sermon, because her father would quiz her on the content that night before supper. If she didn't respond well, the punishment was hard, and it was quick. She hadn't been inside of a church of any kind in 8 years. "Don't think about it," she ordered herself. "Think about now." But now, she saw, was very much like then. It seemed to her very little had changed inside the edges of Progress. Deliberately, she turned onto Live Oak Drive to cruise through the oldest residential section of town. The homes here were large and gracious, the trees old and leafy. Her uncle had moved here a few years before she'd left Progress. On his wife's money, her father had said brittlely. Tori hadn't been allowed to visit there, and even now felt a twinge of guilty panic just driving by the lovely old white brick home with its flowering shrubs and sparkling windows. Her uncle would be at work now managing the bank as he'd managed it nearly as long as she could remember. And though she had a great deal of affection for her aunt, Tori wasn't in the mood for Boots Mooney's fluttering hands and whispery voice. She wove through the streets, past smaller homes and a small apartment complex that hadn't existed 16 years before. She lifted her eyebrows at a corner convenience store that had sprung up in bright reds and yellows out of the old Progress Drive-In. The high school had an addition, and there was a charming little park just off the square where there'd once been a line of crumbling row houses. There were new young trees planted among the old soldiers and graceful flowers spilling out of concrete pots. It all seemed prettier, cleaner, fresher than she remembered. She wondered how much would turn out to be the same under that new coat of varnish. As she turned onto Market, she was ridiculously pleased to see Hanson's was still standing, still wore the same battered old sign, and its front window remained patchworked with flyers and billboards. The sweet childhood taste of grape knee-high immediately filled her mouth, her throat, and made her smile. The beauty salon had changed hands, she noted. Lou's beauty shop was now called Hair Today. But the Market Street diner stood where it had always stood, and it seemed to her the same old men wearing the same overalls were loitering outside to gossip. Midway down the block, tucked between Rollins Paint and Hardware and the Flower Basket, was the old dry goods store. That, Tori thought, as she pulled to the curb, would be her change. She climbed out of the car and stepped into the thick midday heat. The outside of the building was exactly as she remembered. The old clinker bricks cobbled together with the mortar gray as smoke between. The window was high and wide and just now coated with dust and street grime, but she would fix that. The door was glass as well, and cracked. The landlord, she determined, taking out her notebook, would fix that. She'd put a bench outside, the narrow one with the black wrought iron back she was having shipped, and beside it pots filled with purple and white petunias, friendly flowers. High on the window above the bench, she'd have the store name printed, Southern Comfort. That would be what she offered her clientele, comfortable surroundings where the stock was stylishly displayed and discreetly tagged. In her mind, she was already inside, filling shelves, arranging tables and lamps. She didn't hear her name called until she was scooped off her feet. The blood rushed to her head, ringing there while her pulse went into panic trip. "Tori, I thought that was you. I've been keeping an eye out for you the last couple of days." "Wade." His name came out in a whoosh. "I scared you." Immediately contrite, he set her back on her feet. "Sorry, I'm just so glad to see you." "Let me catch my breath." "You catch it while I look at you. Damn, has it really been 2 years? You look wonderful." "Do I?" It was nice to hear, even if she didn't believe it for a minute. She pushed back her hair while her pulse leveled. Though he was a couple of inches shy of 6 feet, she had to tip her head back to study his face. He'd always been pretty, she remembered, but she imagined he was relieved that the angelic face of his youth had weathered a bit. His eyes were a deep, slumberous chocolate. His face had fined down from childhood, but he still boasted dimples. His hair, shades lighter than her own, was well cut to tame the tendency to curl. He was dressed in jeans and a plain cotton shirt of faded blue. As she took his measure, his lips quirked. He looked, she decided, young, handsome, and quietly prosperous. "If I look wonderful, I don't have words for how you look. You got all the handsome in the family, Cousin Wade." He flashed a grin at that, quick and boyish, but resisted hugging her again. Tori, he knew, had always been skittish about hugs and strokes. He settled for giving her hair a little tug. "I'm glad you're back. I couldn't have picked a better welcoming committee." She gestured widely. "The town looks good. Same in a lot of ways, but better, tidier, I suppose." "Progress in progress," he said. "We owe a lot of it to the Lavells, the town council, and particularly the mayor of the last 5 years. You remember Dwight Frazier? Dwight the Dweeb, one of the mighty 3 formed by you, him, and Cade Lavelle. The Dweeb hit his stride in high school, became a track star, married the homecoming queen, went into his daddy's construction business, and helped turn Progress around. We're all goddamn solid citizens these days." Standing there with the light traffic cruising the street behind him, hearing the familiar rhythm of his voice, she remembered why he'd always held her affection. "Miss Hellraisin, do you, Wade?" "Some. Listen, I'm between appointments. I have to get back and convince a Great Dane named Igor he needs his rabies shot." Better you than me, Dr. Mooney. My office is across the street, end of the block. Walk up with me and I'll buy you an iced tea. I'd like that, but I need to go by the realtor and see what they've got lined up for me. She caught the flicker in his eyes and tilted her head. What? I don't know how you'll feel about it, but your old place, it's vacant. The house? Instinctively, she crossed her arms, hugged her elbows. Fate, she thought, had such a long and sneaky reach. I don't know how I feel about it either. I guess I should find out. In a town of less than 6,000, it was hard to walk 2 blocks without running into someone you knew. It didn't matter if you'd been away 16 years or 60. When she stepped into the realtor's office, there was only one person manning a desk. The woman was pretty, petite, and polished. Her long blonde hair was swept back from a heart-shaped face dominated by big baby blue eyes. Afternoon. The woman fluttered her lashes and set aside a paperback novel with a bare-chested pirate on the cover. Can I help you? Tori had a quick image of the playground at Progress Elementary, a group of little girls shrieking in fear and disgust and running away, and the smug, satisfied look in the big blue eyes of the leader as she tossed a sneer over her shoulder while her long blonde hair flew behind her. Lissy Harlow. Lissy cocked her head. Do I know you? Why, I'm so sorry, I just don't. Those blue eyes widened. Tori? Tori Bodine, for heaven's sake. She gave a little squeal and hauled herself to her feet. She looked to be about 6 months pregnant from the bulge under the pale pink shirt. Daddy said how you'd be coming by sometime this week. Despite Tori's automatic step in retreat, Lissy scurried around the desk to embrace her like a long-lost friend. This is so exciting. She pulled back to beam cheer and welcome. Tori Bodine, come back to Progress after all this time, and don't you look pretty. Thank you. Tori watched Lissy's eyes scan, measure, then glint with satisfaction. There was no doubt here who'd grown up better. You looked so much the same, but you always were the prettiest girl in Progress. Oh, what foolishness! Lissy waved a hand, but couldn't stop herself from preening a bit. Now you just sit right down and let me get you something cold to drink. No, don't bother. I'm fine. Did your father get the lease agreement? Seems like he mentioned he did. The whole town's talking about your shop. I can't wait till you're open. You just can't find pretty things in Progress. She walked behind the desk again as she spoke. Lord knows you can't be driving down to Charleston every time you want something with a bit of style. That's good to know. Tori sat and found herself eye level with the sign that identified Lissy Frazier. Frazier? Dwight? You married Dwight? 5 happy years. We have a son. My Luke's the cutest thing. She turned a framed photo around to show off a bright-eyed, tow-headed toddler, and we're expecting his brother or sister by end of summer. She gave the mound of her belly a satisfied pat and wiggled her fingers so her wedding and engagement rings caught the light and flashed fire from the diamonds. You never married, honey? There was just enough bite in the question to let Tori know Lissy still liked being the best. No. I just admire you career women more than I can say. You're all so brave and smart. Y'all put us homebodies to shame. When Tori lifted a brow at the desk and the nameplate, Lissy laughed and waved her hand again. Oh, I just come in a couple of times a week to help Daddy out. Once the baby's born, I'm sure I won't have the time or the energy. And would, Lissy thought, go quickly and not so quietly mad at home with 2 children. But she'd deal with that and Dwight when the time came. Now you just tell me everything you've been up to. I'd love to chat, Lissy. If you yanked my tongue out and wrapped it around my neck, Tori thought. But, she continued, I need to get settled. Oh, how silly of me. You must be just worn out and ready to drop. The thin smile told Tori that if she wasn't, Lissy certainly thought she looked it. We'll have ourselves a nice long catch-up once you're rested. I'll look forward to it. Remember, Tori told herself, this is just the type of customer you need. I ran into Wade just a few minutes ago. He mentioned the house, my old house, might be available to rent. Why, it sure is. The Lavelle tenants moved on just a couple of weeks back. But, honey, you don't want to live way out there now, do you? We got some nice apartments right here in town. River Terrace has everything a single girl could want, including single men, she added with a sly wink. Modern fixtures, wall-to-wall carpet. We got us a garden unit available that's just lovely. I'm not interested in an apartment. I'd enjoy being out in the country a ways. What's the rent? I'll just look that up for you. She knew it, of course. Lissy's mind was much sharper than people expected. She preferred it that way. She shifted her chair, fumbled with the keyboard of her computer a bit for form. I swear I'll never get the hang of these things. You know that's a 2-bedroom, 1-bath frame construction. Yes, I know. Scanning the screen, Lissy tossed off the monthly rent. Now that's a good 15-20-minute drive from town. This sweet little apartment I was telling you about's no more than a 10-minute walk on a pretty day. I'll take the house. Lissy glanced up, blinked. Take it. Don't you want to run out and see it first? I have seen it. I'll write out a check, first and last month's rent. Yes, Lissy shrugged. Just let me print out the rental agreement. Less than 30 seconds after the deal was signed and sealed and Tori walked out with the keys, Lissy was on the phone spreading the word. This, too, had changed. The house stood as it had always stood, back from a narrow dirt lane a short spit from the swamp. Fields spread on its west side, the tender shoots of cotton already sprung up out of the earth, their rows neat as docile schoolchildren. But someone had planted azaleas in pink and white and a young magnolia tree near the bedroom window. She remembered the screens going rusty and the white paint going gray. But someone had taken care here. The windows sparkled and the paint was a fresh and soft blue. A front porch had been added, wide enough for the rocking chair that stood alongside the door. It was almost welcoming. Her pulse beat dull and thick as she walked toward it. There would be ghosts, but ghosts were why she'd come back. Wasn't it better to face them all? The keys rattled in her hand. The screen door squeaked. She told herself it was a homey sound. A friendly screen door should squeak, and it should slam. Bracing it open, she fit the key in the lock, turned it. She took one deep breath before stepping inside. She saw the ragged couch with its faded roses, the old console TV, the frayed braided rug. Dull yellow walls with no pictures to brighten the space. The smell of overcooked greens and Lysol. Tori, you get in here and clean yourself up this minute. Didn't I tell you I wanted this table set for supper before your daddy gets home? Then the image winked away and she stood in an empty room. The walls were painted cream, a plain but serviceable color. The floors were bare but clean. The air carried the faint scent of paint and polish, more efficient than offensive. She stepped through to the kitchen. The counters had been redone in a neutral stone gray and the cabinets painted white. The stove was new, or newer than the one her mother had sweated over. The window over the sink looked out to the swamp as it always had, lush and green and secret. Gathering her courage, she turned and headed toward her old bedroom. Had it always been so small, she wondered. Barely big enough to swing a cat in, she decided, though it had been large enough for her needs. Her bed had been close to the window. She'd liked looking out into the night or into the morning. She'd had a little dresser, and its drawers had swelled and stuck every summer. She'd hidden books in the bottom drawer because Daddy didn't approve of her reading anything but the Bible. There were good memories mixed with the bad in this room. Of reading late into the night in secret, of dreaming private dreams, of planning adventures with hope. And, of course, of the beatings. No one would ever lay hands on her again. It would make a reasonable office, she decided, a desk, a file cabinet, perhaps a reading chair and lamp. It would do. She would sleep in her parents' old room. Yes, she would sleep there, and she would make it her own. She started to go out, but couldn't resist. Quietly, she opened the closet door. There, the ghost of herself huddled in the dark, face streaked with tears. She'd shed tears of a lifetime before she was 8. Crouching, she ran her fingers along the baseboard, and they trembled over the shallow carving. With her eyes closed, she read the letters with fingertips, the way the blind read Braille. I am Tori. That's right. That's right. I am Tori. You couldn't take that from me, couldn't beat that out of me. I'm Tori, and I'm back. Unsteadily, she got to her feet. Air, she thought. She needed air. There was never any air in the closet, never any light. Sweat sprang to her palms as she backed up. She turned to dash from the room, would have run from the house, but a shadow wavered outside the screen door. The afternoon sun poured in behind it, outlined it into the shape of a man. As the door squeaked open, she was 8 years old again, alone, helpless, terrified. 4. The shadow said her name, the whole of it, Victoria, so that it flowed out like something rich poured from a warmed bottle. She might have run, and it shamed and surprised her to find there was still that much rabbit inside her that wanted to careen away, plunge into a bolt hole at the first snap of a twig. The ghosts of the house circled around her, whispering taunts in her ear. She'd run before, more than once. It had never saved her. She stood where she was, frozen. Panic swam up sickly from gut to throat as the door creaked open. "I've frightened you, I'm sorry." His voice was quiet, the tone a man uses to soothe the injured or complete a seduction. "I wanted to stop by, see if you needed anything." He stood just inside the door so the sun beamed behind him, blurred his features. In her mind, thoughts tumbled, going soft so they spilled over each other. "How did you know I was here?" "Have you been away so long you don't know how quick the grapevine climbs in progress?" There was a smile in his voice, calculated, she thought, to put her at ease. It meant the fear showed, and made her too easy a target. That, at least that, she could stop. She folded her hands. "No, I haven't forgotten anything. Who are you?" "That sound you hear is my ego crumbling. Even after all these years, I could have picked you out in a crowd." "It's Cade," he said, and stepped closer. "Kincaid Lavelle." He stepped out of the harsh light until it fell behind him into sun and shadow. The keenest edge of fear ebbed with the glare, and she saw him clearly. Kincaid Lavelle, Hope's brother. Would she have recognized him? No, she didn't think so. The boy she remembered had been thin of body and soft of face. This man's build was rangy, hinted of tough in the muscles of the forearms showing under the rolled-up sleeves of his work shirt. And though he smiled easily enough, there was nothing soft in the sharp bones and high planes of his face. His hair was darker than it had been, the color of walnuts, with the curling tips bleached out by the sun. He'd always been one for the out-of-doors, she remembered that. Remembered she'd sometimes see him walking the fields with his father in a kind of swagger that came from owning the land your feet landed on. The eyes, she thought, she might have placed the eyes, that deep summer blue, like Hope's. The sun had left its mark there as well, with faint lines etched into the corners, the kind, she thought, that brought men character and women despair. Those eyes watched her now with a kind of lazy patience that might have embarrassed her if her pulse had been level. "It's been a long time," was the best she could do. "About half my life." He didn't offer his hand. Instinct told him she'd only jolt and embarrass both of them. She looked ready to jump or collapse. Neither would suit him. Instead, he tucked his thumbs casually in the front pockets of his jeans. "Why don't you come on out on the front porch and sit down? It appears that old rocker's the only chair we've got right now." "I'm fine, I'm all right." White as death was what she was, with those soft gray eyes that had always fascinated him, still wide and bright. Growing up in a household largely dominated by women had taught him how to get around female pride and sulks with the least fuss and energy. He simply turned back, pushed open the screen. "Stuffy in here," he said, and stepped out, keeping the door wide and banking on manners, nudging her to follow. Left with little choice, she crossed the room, walked out onto the porch. He caught the faintest drift of her scent and thought of the jasmine that preferred to bloom at night, almost in secret, in his mother's garden. "Must be an experience." He touched her now lightly to guide her to the chair. "Coming back here." She didn't jump, but she did edge away in a small but deliberate motion. "I needed a place to live and wanted to settle in quickly." Her stomach muscles refused to loosen up again. She didn't like talking to men this way. You never knew, not for certain, what was under the easy words and easy smiles. "You've been living in Charleston a while. Life's a lot quieter here." "I want quiet." He leaned back against the rail. There was an edge here, he mused. However delicate she looked, there was an edge, like a raw nerve ready to scream. Odd, he realized, it was just what he remembered most about her. Her delicacy, like the business end of a scalpel. "There's a lot of talk about your store." "That's good." She smiled, just the faintest curve of lips, but her eyes remained serious and watchful. "Talk means curiosity, and curiosity will bring people through the door." "Did you run a store in Charleston?" "I managed one. Owning's different." "So it is." Beau Rev was his now, and owning was indeed different. He glanced behind him out to the fields where seedlings and sprouts reached for the sun. "How does it look to you, Tori, after all this time and distance?" "The same." She didn't look at the fields, but at him. "And not at all the same." "I was thinking that about you. You grew up." He looked back at her, watched her fingers curl on the arms of the chair as if to steady herself. Grew into your eyes. You always had a woman's eyes. When I was 12, they spooked me. It took the will and the pride she'd carved into herself to keep her gaze level. When you were 12, you were too busy running wild with my cousin Wade and Dwight Frazier to pay any notice of me. You're wrong about that. When I was 12, he said slowly, there was a space of time I noticed everything about you. I still carry that picture of you inside my head. Why don't we stop pretending she's not standing right here between us? Tori rose in a jerk, walked to the far end of the porch, and stood, arms crossed over her chest, to stare out at the fields. We both loved her, Cade said. We both lost her, and neither of us has forgotten her. The weight descended on her chest like hands pushing. I can't help you. I'm not asking you for help. For what, then? Puzzled, he shifted, then settled back again to study her profile. She'd closed up, he realized. Whatever small opening there'd been was shuttered down again. I'm not asking for anything, Tori. Is that what you expect from everyone? She felt stronger now on her feet and turned to give him a steady stare. Yes. A bird darted behind him, a quick gray flash that swept by and found a perch in one of the tupelos edging the swamp. And there, it seemed to her, it sang its heart out for hours before Cade spoke again. Had she forgotten this, she wondered, the long, easy pauses, the patient rhythm of country conversations? That's a pity, he said, as her blood began to beat in the silence. But I don't want anything from you except maybe a friendly word now and then. The fact is, Hope meant something to both of us. Losing her had an effect on my life. I hesitate to call a lady a liar, but if you were to stand there eye to eye with me and tell me it didn't affect yours, that's what I'd have to do. What difference does it make to you how I feel? She wanted to rub the chill from her arms, but resisted. We don't know each other. We never really did. We knew her. Maybe your coming back stirs things to the surface again. That's no fault of yours. It just is. Is this visit a welcome back or a warning for me to keep my distance? He said nothing for a moment, then shook his head. The humor slid back into his eyes, a glint so much speedier than his voice. You sure grew up prickly. First, I don't make a habit of asking beautiful women to keep their distance. I'd be the one to suffer, wouldn't I? She didn't smile, but he did, and this time deliberately took a step closer. Perhaps the motion, perhaps the sound of work boots on wood sent the bird deeper into the swamp and silenced the song. You could always tell me to keep mine, but I'm unlikely to listen. I came by to welcome you back, Tori, and to get a look at you. I got a right to my own curiosity, and seeing you bring some of that summer back, that's a natural thing. It's going to bring it back for others, too. You had to know that before you decided to come. I came for me. Is that why you look sick and scared and tired, he wondered. Then welcome home, he said. He held out his hand. She hesitated, but it seemed as much a dare as an offering. When she placed hers in it, she found his warm and harder than she'd expected. Just as she felt the connection, a kind of quiet internal click, unexpected and unwelcome. I'm sorry if it seems unfriendly, she slid her hand free, but I've got a lot of work to do. I need to get started. You just let me know if there's anything I can do for you. I appreciate that. You fixed the house up nice. It's a good house. But he looked at her as he said it. It's a good spot. I'll let you get doing, he added, and started down the steps. He stopped beside a tough-looking pickup that desperately needed washing. Tori, you know that picture of you I carried in my head? He opened the truck door, and a quick little breeze ruffled through his sun-streaked hair. I got a better one now. He drove off, keeping her framed in the rearview mirror until he made the turn from hard-packed dirt to asphalt. He hadn't meant to bring up Hope, not right off. As the owner of Beau Rev, as her landlord, as a childhood acquaintance, he'd told himself it was a straight duty call. But he hadn't fooled himself, and he obviously hadn't fooled Tori either. Curiosity had sent him straight out to what people hereabouts still call the Marsh House, when he'd had a dozen pressing matters demanding his attention. He'd been raised to run the farm, but he ran it his own way. That way didn't please everyone. He'd learned to play politician and diplomat. He'd learned to play whatever role was required as long as he got what he wanted. He wondered just what role he'd need to play with Tori. Whether she was ready to admit it or not, her coming back shifted all manner of balances. She was the pebble in the pond, and the ripples were going to run long and wide. He wasn't sure what to do about her, what he wanted to do about her. But he was a man of the land, and men who made their living from earth and seed and weather knew how to bide time. On impulse, he pulled the truck to the side of the road. He had no business making this stop when all his responsibilities were gathered at Beau Rev. The new crops were coming up, and when the crops grew, so did the weeds. He had cultivating to oversee. This was a pivotal year for the plans he'd implemented. He wanted his finger on every step and stage. Still, he got out of the cab, walked across the little wooden bridge, and stepped into the swamp. Here the world was green and rich and alive. Paths had been cleared, and alongside them, neat as a park, grew azaleas in staggering, stubborn bloom. Among the magnolia and tupelo were swaths of wildflowers, tidy hills and spears of evergreens. It was no longer the exciting, slightly dangerous world of his youth. Now it was a shrine to a lost child. His father had done this, in grief, in pride, perhaps even in the fury he'd never shown. But it had lived inside him, Cade knew, like a cancer, growing and spreading in secret and silence, those tumors of rage and despair. Grief had been treated like a disease inside the walls of Beau Rev, and here he thought it had been turned to flowers. Lilies would dance in the summer, a colorful parade, and the delicate yellow irises that liked their feet wet were already blooming in the spring shadows like tiny sunbeams. Brush had been cleared for them. Though it grew back quickly, as long as his father had lived, there'd been hands to hack it down again. Now the responsibility lay on Cade as well. There was a small stone bench in the clearing where Hope had built her fire that last night of her life. There was another arched bridge over the tobacco-brown water haunted by cypress trees, bordered by thickly curling ferns and rhododendrons flowering in sheer white, camellias and pansies that would bring flower and scent over the winter when they thrived. And between the bench and the bridge, in the midst of a pool of pink and blue blossoms, stood a marble statue carved in the likeness of a laughing young girl who would be forever 8. They'd buried her 18 years before on a hill in the sunlight, but here in the green shadows and wild scents was where Hope's spirit lay. Cade sat on the bench, let his hands dangle between his knees. He didn't come here often. Since his father's death 8 years before, no one did, at least no one in the family. As far as his mother was concerned, this place ceased to exist from the moment Hope had been found, raped, strangled, then tossed aside like a used-up doll. Just how much, Cade asked himself as he had countless times over that long sea of years, just how much of what had been done to her was on his head. He sat back, closed his eyes. He'd lied to Tori, he admitted now. He did want something from her. He wanted answers. Answers he'd waited for more than half his life. He took 5 precious minutes to steady himself. Strange, he hadn't realized until now how much it had unnerved him to see her again. She'd been right that he'd paid scant attention to her when they were children. She'd been the little Bodine girl his sister had run with, and beneath the notice of a 12-year-old boy. Until that morning, that horrible morning in August when she'd come to the door with her cheek raw and bruised and her wide eyes terrified. From that moment there'd been nothing about her he hadn't noticed, nothing about her he'd forgotten. He'd made it his business to know all there was to know about where she'd gone, what she'd done, who she'd been, long after she left Progress. He'd known nearly to the hour when she'd begun making her plans to come back. And still he hadn't been prepared to see her standing in that empty room, the color leached out of her face so that her eyes stood out like pools of smoke. They'd both take time to settle, Cade decided as he got to his feet, and then they'd deal with each other. Then they'd deal with Hope. He walked back to his truck, drove out to check his crops and his crew. He was hot, sweaty, and dirty by the time he turned between the stone pillars that guarded the long, shady lane to Beau Rev. 20 oaks, 10 on either side, flanked the drive and arched over it to make a green and gold tunnel. In between their thick trunks he could see the flowering shrubs in bloom, the wide sweep of lawn, the ribbon of a bricked path that led to garden and outbuildings. When he was tired, as he was now, this last stretch never failed to reach out to him, to stroke at his fatigue like a loving hand. Through drought and war, through the ripping apart of one way of life and the making of another, Beau Rêve stood. More than 200 years the land had been in Lavelle hands. They had tended it, nurtured it, abused it, and cursed it, but it survived. It had buried them, and it had birthed them, and now it was his. Perhaps the house was one huge eccentricity in the center of elegance, more fortress than house, more defiant than graceful. The stone caught sparks from the dying sun and glinted. The towers lanced arrogantly into a sky going the color of a fresh bruise. There was a huge pool of flowers in the oval centering the circular drive. Some long ago ancestor's attempt to soften the arrogantly masculine lines, Cade had always thought. Instead, the sea of flowers and shrubs served as a sharp contrast to the massive front doors of deeply carved oak and the straight spears of windows. He left the truck at the far curve of the drive and walked up the 6 stone steps. The veranda had been added on by his great-grandfather, a bit of civility, Cade mused, with its shading roof and twining vines of clematis. He could sit, if he chose, as those of his blood had sat for generations, and look out over grass and tree and flower without smudging the view with the vicious and sweat-soaked work of the fields, which was why he rarely sat there. He scraped the soil off his boots. Inside those doors was his mother's domain, and though she would say nothing, her disapproving silence, her cool-eyed stare at any trace of the fields on her floors, would be worse than a blistering lecture. Spring had been kind, so the windows were open to the evening. The scents from the garden spilled in to mingle with the perfumes of the flowers that had been selected and arranged indoors. The entrance hall was massive, the floor marbled in sea green, so it felt as though his feet would simply sink into cool water. He thought of a shower, a beer, and a good hot meal before he tackled the evening's paperwork. He moved quietly, listening, and felt no guilt at the hope he could avoid any contact with his family until he was clean and refueled. He'd gotten as far as the bar in the main parlor, had just popped the top on a Beck's, when he heard the feminine click of heels. He winced, but his face was composed and relaxed when Faith swirled into the room. "Pour me a white wine, darling. I got some rough edges need smoothing." She stretched herself out on the sofa as she spoke, with a fussy little sigh and a finger brush of her short bob of blonde hair. She was back to blonde. There were those who said Faith Lavelle changed her hair color nearly as often as she changed men. There were those who relished saying it. She'd been divorced twice in her 26 years and had gathered and discarded more lovers than most cared to count, particularly Faith. Yet she managed to project the image of the delicate southern flower with camellia white skin and the Lavelle blue eyes, moody blue eyes that could well up with tears on command and were skilled at making promises she might or might not intend to keep. Her first husband had been a wild and handsome boy of 18 with whom she'd eloped 2 months before she graduated from high school. She'd loved him with all the passion and capriciousness of youth and had been devastated when he'd left her flat and broke less than a year later. Not that she let anyone know that. As far as the world was concerned, she'd dumped Bobby Lee Matthews and had come back to Beau Rêve because she'd grown bored playing house. 3 years later, she'd married an aspiring country western singer she'd met in a bar. That she had done out of boredom, but she'd stuck it out for 2 years before she realized Clive had also aspired to live the cheating, beating lyrics of the songs he scribbled in a haze of Budweiser and Marlboros. So once again she was back at Beau Rêve, edgy, dissatisfied, and secretly disgusted with herself. She sent Cade a sweet and melting smile when he brought her a glass of wine. "Honey, you look worn out. Why don't you sit down and put your feet up for a while?" She grabbed his hand, gave it a little tug. "You work too hard." "Anytime you want to pitch in." Her smile sharpened, a blade turned to the keen edge. "Beau Rêve is yours. Papa made that clear all our lives." "Papa's not here anymore." Faith merely moved one careless shoulder. "Doesn't change the facts." She lifted her wine, sipped. She was a lovely woman who took great pains to exploit her beauty. Even now, for an evening at home, she'd added soft color to her cheeks, painted her sensuously wide mouth a poppy pink, and had draped herself in a silk blouse and slacks in soft rose. "You can change anything you want to change." "I've been raised to be decorative and useless." She tossed her head, then stretched like a cat. "And I'm so good at it." "You irritate me, Faith." I'm good at that, too. Amused, she nudged his leg with her bare foot. Don't be cross, Cade. Arguing's going to spoil my taste for this wine. I've already had words with Mama today. A day doesn't go by you don't have words with Mama. I wouldn't if she wasn't so critical of every damn thing. She's been in a mood most of the day. Faith's eyes glittered. Since Lissy called from town, anyhow. No point in it. She knew Tori was coming back. Coming's different from being. I don't think she likes the idea of renting the Marsh house to her. If she doesn't live there, she'll just live somewhere else. Since he was tired, he lay his head back and tried to will the tension of the day out of his neck and shoulders. She's back, and it appears she means to stay. So you did go see her. Faith drummed her fingers against her thigh. I thought you would. Duty first for our Cade. Well, what's she like? Polite, reserved, nervous, I think, about being back. He took a sip of beer. Attractive. Attractive? I remember tree bark hair and knobby knees, skinny and spooky. He let it pass. Faith tended to pout if a man, even her brother, commented on another woman's good looks. He wasn't in the mood for her sulks. You could make the effort to be nice to her, Faith. Tori wasn't responsible for what happened to Hope. What's the point of making her feel as though she were? Did I say I wasn't going to be nice to her? Faith ran her fingers around the rim of her glass. She couldn't seem to keep them still. I imagined she could use a friend. Faith dropped her hand and her silky voice went flat. She was Hope's friend, never mine. Maybe not, but Hope's not here anymore either, and you could use a friend yourself. Honey, I got plenty of friends. It's just that none of them happens to be a woman. Fact is, things are so dull around here, I might go into town tonight after all, see if I can find me a friend for a few hours. Suit yourself. He pushed her foot aside and rose. I need a shower. Cade, she said before he got to the door. She'd seen that flare of derision in his eyes, and it stung. I got a right to live my life as I choose. You got a right to waste your life as you choose. All right, she said evenly, and so do you. But I'm saying maybe for once I agree with Mama on one thing. We'd all be better off if Victoria Bodine went back to Charleston and stayed there. You'd sure as hell be better off keeping your distance from whatever trouble she's carrying with her. What are you afraid of, Faith? Everything, she thought, as he walked away. Just everything. Restless now, she uncurled herself and paced to the tall front windows. Gone now was the languorous southern belle. Her movements were quick, almost jittering with nervous energy. Maybe she would go into town, she thought. Go somewhere. Maybe she'd just leave altogether. And go where? Nothing was what she thought it would be when she left Beau Rêve. No one was how she thought they would be, including herself. Every time she left, she told herself it was for good, but she always came back. Every time she left, she told herself it would be different, that she would be different, but she never was. How could she expect anyone to understand that everything that had happened before, everything that had happened since, all hinged on that one night when Hope had been 8? Now the person who connected the night with all the others was back. Standing looking out over the lawn and gardens going silver with dusk, Faith wished Tori Bodine to hell. It was nearly 8 when Wade finished with his last patient, an elderly mixed breed with failing kidneys and a heart murmur. His equally elderly owner couldn't bring herself to put the poor old dog down, so Wade had once again treated the dog and gently soothed the human. He was too tired for the diner and thought he'd just slap together a sandwich or open a can. The small apartment above his office suited him. It was efficient, convenient, and cheap. He could have afforded better, and so both of his parents continually reminded him, but he preferred to live simply and shovel the profits of his practice back into it. He had no pets of his own at the moment, though he'd had quite a menagerie as a child. Dogs and cats, of course, and with them the prerequisite wounded birds, the frogs, the turtles, the rabbits, and once a runt pig he'd called Buster. His indulgent mother hadn't drawn the line until he'd wanted to bring home a black snake he'd found stretched across the road. He'd been sure he could talk her into it, but when he'd come to the kitchen door with a plea in his eyes and 4 feet of wiggling snake in his hands, his mother had screamed loud enough to bring Mr. Pritchett from next door leaping over their shared fence. Pritchett had sprained his hamstring, Wade's mother had dropped her beloved milk glass pitcher on the kitchen tiles, and the snake had been banished to the river outside of town. But bless her, Wade thought, she'd tolerated everything else he'd dragged in with hardly a word of complaint. Eventually, Eventually he'd have a house and yard and the time to indulge himself, but until he could afford a larger staff, most of his workdays ran 10 hours minimum, and that didn't count emergencies. People who didn't have the time to devote to pets shouldn't have them. He felt the same way about children. He headed into the kitchen first, grabbed an apple. Dinner, such as it was, would wait until he'd washed the dog off him. Crunching into the apple, he flipped through the mail he'd carried up with him as he walked to the bedroom. He smelled her before he saw her. That hot wave of woman hit his senses, scattered his thoughts. She stirred on the bed, a rustle of silky skin against the sheets. She wore nothing but an inviting smile. "Hello, lover, you worked late. You said you'd be busy tonight." Faith crooked a finger. "I intend to be. Why don't you come over here and occupy me?" Wade tossed the mail and the apple aside. "Why don't I?" Five. It was a pitiful thing, Wade supposed, for a man to be hung up on one woman all of his life. More than pitiful when that woman insisted on flitting in and out of that life like a careless butterfly, and the man let her. Each time she came back, he told himself he wouldn't play the game, and each time she hooked him in until he was too deep into the pot to fold his hand and walk away. He'd been the first man to have her. He had no hope of being the last. He was no more able to resist her now than he'd been over 10 years before. That bright summer night she'd climbed in his window and into his bed while he slept. He could still remember what it had been like to wake with that sleek, hot body sliding over his, that hungry mouth smothering him, devouring him, clamping over him until he was rock hard and randy. She was 15 years old, he thought now, and she'd taken him with the quick, heartless efficiency of a $50 whore, and she'd been a virgin. That, she told him, had been the point. She didn't want to be a virgin, and she'd decided to get rid of the burden with as little fuss as possible, and with someone she knew, liked, and trusted. Simple as that. For Faith, it had always been simple. But for Wade, that summer night, weeks before he'd gone back to college, had layered on the first of many complicated tiers that made up his relationship with Faith Lavelle. They'd had sex as often as they could manage that summer, in the back seat of his car late at night when his parents slept down the hall, in the middle of the day when his mother sat on the veranda gossiping with friends. Faith was always willing, eager, ready. She'd been a young man's wet dream sprung to life, and had become Wade's obsession. He'd been sure she'd wait for him. In less than 2 years, while he'd been studying fiercely and planning for the future, their future, she'd run off with Bobby Lee. Wade had gotten drunk and stayed drunk for a week. She'd come back, of course, to Progress and eventually to him, with no apology, no tearful plea for forgiveness. That was the pattern of their relationship. He detested her for it nearly as much as he detested himself. "So," Faith climbed over him, tugged a cigarette from the pack on the nightstand, and straddling him, lighted it. "Tell me about Tori." "When did you start smoking again?" "Today." She smiled, leaning down to give him a little nip on the chin. "Don't give me grief on it, Wade. Everyone's entitled to a vice." "Which one have you missed?" She laughed, but there was an edge to it, an edge in her eyes. "If you don't try 'em out, how do you know which ones fit? Now, come on, baby, tell me about Tori. I'm just dying to know everything." "There's nothing to know. She's back." Faith let out a huge sigh. Men are such irritating creatures. What does she look like? How does she act? What's she up to? "She looks grown up and acts very much the same. She's up to opening a gift shop on Market Street." At Faith's cool stare, he shrugged. "Tired? She looks tired, maybe a little too thin, like someone who hasn't been altogether well just lately." but there's a sheen on her, the kind you get from city living. As for what she's up to, I can't say. Why don't you ask her?" She trailed her hand over his shoulder. He had such wonderful shoulders. "She's not likely to tell me. Never liked me." "That's not true, Faith." "I ought to know." Impatient, she rolled off him, off the bed, graceful and contrary as a cat, drawing deep on her cigarette while she paced. The moonlight shimmered over her white skin, lending it a faint and exotic blue cast. He could see fading smudges on her, the shadows of bruises. She'd wanted it rough. "Always staring at me with those spooky eyes, hardly saying boo except to Hope. She always had plenty to say to Hope. The two of them were all the time whispering together. What's she want to move back into the old Marsh house for? What's she thinking?" "I imagine she's thinking it'd be nice to have a familiar roof over her head." He rose, quietly closing the curtains before one of the neighbors saw her. "You know what went on under that roof as well as I do." Faith turned back, her eyes glittering when Wade switched the bedside light on low. "What kind of person goes back to a place where they were trapped? Maybe she's as crazy as people used to say." "She's not crazy." Weary now, Wade tugged on his jeans. "She's lonely. Sometimes lonely people come back home because there's no place else." That hit a little too close to the heart. She turned her eyes away from his, tapped out her cigarette. "Sometimes home's the loneliest place of all." He touched her hair, just a light stroke. It made her yearn to burrow in, cling tight. Deliberately she lifted her head and smiled brilliantly. "Why are we talking about Tory Bodine anyway? Let's fix ourselves some supper and eat in bed." Slowly, her eyes on his, she drew down the zipper of his jeans. "I always have such an appetite when I'm with you." Later, he woke in the dark. She was gone. She never stayed, never slept with him in the most simple way. There were times Wade wondered if she slept at all, or if that internal engine of hers forever ran, fueled on nerves and on needs that were never quite met. It was his curse, he supposed, to love a woman who seemed incapable of returning genuine feelings. He should cut her out of his life. It was the sane thing to do. She'd only slice him open again, and every time she did, it took longer to heal. Sooner or later, there'd be nothing left of his heart but scar tissue, and he'd have no one but himself to blame. He felt the anger building, a black heat that bubbled in the blood. Leaving the lights off, he dressed in the dark. His fury needed a target before it turned inward and imploded. It would have been smarter, more comfortable, God knew more sensible, to have booked a room in a hotel for the night. It would have been a simple matter to have accepted her uncle's hospitality and slept in one of the overly fussy, decorated-to-death bedrooms Boots kept ready in the big house. As a child, she'd often dreamed of sleeping in that perfect house on that perfect street where she'd imagined everything smelled of perfume and polish. Instead, Tori spread a blanket on the bare floor and lay awake in the dark. Pride, stubbornness, a need to prove herself. She wasn't sure of her own motives for spending her first night in progress in the empty house of her childhood, but she'd made her bed, so to speak, and was determined to lie in it. In the morning, there would be a great deal to do. Already that evening she'd gone over her lists and made a dozen more. She needed to buy a bed and a phone, new towels, a shower curtain. She needed a lamp and a table to put it on. Camping out wasn't quite the adventure it used to be, and having simple tastes and needs didn't mean she didn't require basic comforts. Lying there in the dark, she used her lists in much the same way she had used the sheer white wall. Each item mentally ticked off was another brick set in place to block out images and keep herself centered in the now. She'd go to the market and stock the kitchen. If she let that go too long, she'd fall back into the habit of skipping meals again. When she neglected her body, it was more difficult to control her mind. She'd go to the bank, open accounts, personal and business. A trip to the Progress Weekly was in order. She'd already designed her ad. Most of all, while she set up the store in the next week, she needed to be visible. She'd work on being friendly, personable, normal. It would take time to weather the expected whispers, the questions, the stares. She was prepared for it. By the time she opened for business, people would be used to seeing her again. Much more important, they would become used to seeing her as she wanted to be seen. Gradually, she'd become a fixture in the town, and then she would begin to explore. She would ask questions. She'd begin to look for the answers. When she had them, she could say goodbye to hope. Closing her eyes, she listened to the night sounds, the chorus of peepers so cheerfully monotonous, the sharp and jarring screech of an owl on the hunt, the soft groans of old wood settling, the occasional sly riveting of mice making themselves at home behind the wall. She'd have to set traps, she thought sleepily. She was sorry for it, but she didn't care to share her space with rodents. She put mothballs under the porches to discourage snakes. It was mothballs, wasn't it? It had been so long since she'd lived in the country. You put out mothballs for snakes and hung soap for deer and protected what was yours, even though it had been theirs first. And if the rabbits came to nibble at the kitchen garden, you laid out pieces of hose so they thought it was the snakes you shooed away with the mothballs. Else Daddy'd come home and shoot 'em with his .22. You'd have to eat them for supper, even though you got sick after because you could see how cute they were, twitching their long ears. You had to eat what God provided or pay the price. Getting sick was better than getting a beating. No, don't think about that, she ordered herself, and shifted on the hard floor. No one was going to make her eat what she didn't want to eat, not ever again. No one was going to raise a strap to her, or a fist. She was in charge now. She dreamed of sitting on the soft ground by a fire that snapped and smoked and burned the marshmallows she held into the flame on a stick. She liked it burnt so that the outside was black and crackled over the gooey white center. Lifting it out, she blew on the fire that came with it. She singed the roof of her mouth, but that was all part of the ritual, the quick pain, then the contrast of crisp and sweet sugar. Might as well eat charcoal, Hope said, turning her own candy so that it bubbled gold. Now this is a perfectly toasted marshmallow. I like them my way. To prove it, Tori got another from the bag and stabbed it onto the pointy end of her stick. Like Lila says, to each his own, said the lady as she kissed the cow. Grinning, Hope nibbled delicately on her marshmallow. I'm glad you came back, Tori. I always wanted to. I guess maybe I was afraid. I guess I still am. But you're here. You came just like you were supposed to. I didn't come that night. Tori looked away from the fire into the eyes of childhood. I guess you weren't supposed to. I promised I would. 10:35. Then I didn't. I didn't even try. You have to try now, 'cause there were more, and there'll still be more until you stop it. The weight was lowering again so that her 8-year-old chest strained under it. What do you mean, more? More like me, just like me? Solemn blue eyes, deep as pools, looked through the smoke and into Tori's. You have to do what you're supposed to do, Tori. You have to be careful and you have to be smart. Victoria Bodine, girl spy. Hope I'm not a girl anymore. That's why it's time. The fire climbed higher, grew brighter. The deep blue eyes captured glints of it, specks of wild light. You have to stop it. How? But Hope shook her head and whispered, Something's in the dark. Tori's eyes shot open. Her heart was thundering in her chest, and in her mouth was the taste of fear and burnt candy. Something's in the dark. She heard it, the echo of Hope's voice, and the rustle like a tail of the wind through the leaves, just outside her window. She saw it, the faint shifting of the light as someone stepped into the path of the moon. The child inside her wanted to curl up, to cover her face with her hands, to will herself invisible. She was alone, defenseless. Whoever was outside was watching, waiting. Even through the fear, she could feel that. She struggled to blank her mind, to bring the face, the form, the name into it, but there was only the sheer glass wall of terror. Not all the terror was hers. They're afraid too, she realized. Afraid of me. Why? Her hand trembled as she slowly reached out for the flashlight beside the blanket. The solid weight of it helped her beat back the worst of the fear. She would not lie helpless. She would defend herself. She would confront. She would take charge. The child had been a victim. The woman wouldn't be. She swung up to her knees, flicked at the switch, fumbled, nearly screamed when the beam flashed on. She aimed it at the window like a weapon. And there was nothing there but shadows and moon. Her breath came in pants, but she got to her feet. She rushed to the door, slapped on the overhead lights. Whoever was outside could see her now. Let them look, she thought. Let them see she wouldn't cower in the dark. The beam of light bobbed as she hurried from the bedroom into the kitchen. Again, she switched on the overheads. Let them look, she thought again, and grabbed a carving knife out of the wooden block she'd unpacked. Let them look and see I'm not defenseless. She'd locked the doors, a habit she'd developed in the city, but she was well aware how useless such a precaution was here. One good kick would spring the locks. She stepped out of the light into the shadows of the living room. With her back to the wall, she willed herself to regulate her breathing until it began to come slow and quiet. She couldn't see if her thoughts were tumbling, couldn't concentrate if her blood was screaming. For the first time in over 4 years, she prepared to open herself to the gift she'd been cursed with at birth. But light stabbed through the front window and washed across the room. Her thoughts scattered wild as blown petals at the sound of a car driving fast up her lane. Tires sent the thin layer of gravel spitting, an impatient, demanding sound. Her breath came harsh again as she forced herself to the door. She jabbed the flashlight in the pocket of the sweat she'd slept in, gripped the knife firmly in one hand, and turned the lock. The car lights clicked off as the driver yanked open the door. "What do you want?" Snatching the flashlight again, Tori shoved at the switch. "What are you doing here?" "Just visiting an old friend." Tori aimed the beam at the figure that stepped out of the car. Her knees went weak, her skin clammy. Hope. She choked out the name as the knife slipped from her fingers and clattered to the floor. Oh, God! Another dream, another episode, or maybe it was just madness. Maybe it always had been. She stepped up to the porch. Moonlight shimmered onto her hair, into her eyes. The screen door creaked as she opened it. "You look like you've seen a ghost, or were expecting one." She bent down, picked up the knife. With one elegant finger, she tapped the tip of the blade. "But I'm real enough." So saying, she held up the finger, and the tiny drop of blood gleamed. "It's Faith," she added, and simply walked in. "I saw your light as I was driving by." Faith? There was a rush like the sea in her head. The joy in it, that frantic leap of it, ebbed as she said the name again. Faith. "That's right. Got anything to drink around here?" She wandered into the kitchen. As if she owned the place, Tori thought, then reminded herself that the Lavells did indeed own the place. She ran a hand over her face into her hair, then bracing herself, followed Faith into the kitchen. "I have some iced tea."